I walk a straight line, shackled and chained. Oh, gruesome Gertie is calling my name. There is no mercy in this penitentiary. Just ask the Hillstring Gang or Angola 3. I'm here for life, I'm here to die. Inside these walls, inside the wire. And when the wolf cries, I know it's over. Oh, Bloody Angola. Oh, Bloody Angola.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to Bloody Angola, a podcast 142 years in the making, the complete story of America's bloodiest prison. I'm Jim Chapman, and I want to thank everyone for checking us out this week on Bloody Angola. And look, we don't just feature the history of America's bloodiest prison, although last week's episode, man, I went way back. If you are into the history of prisons in general, but especially Louisiana State Penitentiary, check that episode out. I think it was really interesting. But that's not all I do. I also feature stories of the incarcerated there. And today I'm going to take you not only through a case and an investigation, but also the conviction and eventual incarceration at Louisiana State Penitentiary of those responsible for the murder of Genore Guillory. And before I get into it, I want to shout out Miss Nicole Bess. I would say quite a while ago, she sent me a message asking me to do a story on this particular case. And so, Miss Nicole, I finally got to it. And here it is. I hope you enjoy it. So I'm going to take you back to June 26th in the year 2000 in the small community of Clinton, Louisiana. Now, on a seemingly normal Monday morning, a deputy sheriff by the name of Ronald Johnson, he gets a call to perform what's known as a wellness check at a home in East Feliciana Parish. So he shows up to this rural house, and as soon as he gets to the door, he's welcomed by what you would refer to as the scent of death. Just an odor that is unmistakable. I know a lot of you out there, when there's a pet, maybe you live by some woods or something and an animal gets killed in the woods and you can smell it after a couple of days. Well, that times 10, right? Now, even for this seasoned deputy, it took him aback. So he makes entry into the home, and that scent intensifies. And he's almost like a bloodhound. He's following the strength of that just horrid scent. And that scent eventually leads him into a master bedroom where just an absolutely gruesome scene awaits him. So he peers into that bedroom, and there he sees the body of a 42-year-old named Genore Guillory. She is lifeless and nude on the floor. The scene was so gruesome, in fact, that he walked outside the house, picks up his CB to radio for backup to the house, and throws up by his patrol car. Now, a detective by the name of Don McKee, he arrives on the scene shortly after, and they get to work trying to figure out what the hell happened to this woman. So, before I go any further, I want to give you a little information on Genore Guillory and who she was. She was a beautiful black woman. She lived a modest yet fulfilling life in a 2-story wood-framed home on the end of a gravel road in Clinton, Louisiana. And as common in that Clinton, Louisiana area, most of your homes are surrounded by some acreage. These aren't neighborhoods. And she had several acres that surrounded her home. She also had a love for animals, dogs in particular. As a matter of fact, she had 30 dogs that she kept safely kenneled in her back property. And she also loved horses, and she had 4 horses which she stabled nearby. Now, in her personal life, Genore was a personnel specialist at an insurance firm in Baton Rouge, which is about 60 miles from where she lived in Clinton. And she absolutely loved her job. She was known by her colleagues as very professional, very kind, very positive, and very generous. As a matter of fact, a coworker of hers named Linda Cuno actually described her as the most generous person she ever encountered. So this is not someone you would think would end up with the fate that I'm about to tell you about. On this particular Friday, Genore had taken a half day off to clean her house. However, on that Monday, when she failed to arrive at work, which was not like her at all, her friends knew something wasn't right. Something had to be wrong. So they started calling her cell phone, and they get no answer. Voicemail, voicemail, voicemail. So they call her house, and it's busy. They call it again. It's busy. They do this for several hours, and it's obvious the phone is off the hook on her landline. So that's when they reach out to the East Feliciana Parish Sheriff's Department, and they say, hey, can you go check on Miss G, as she was known? So back on the crime scene, Detective McKee, he finds himself making entry into the residence. He noticed that a side door to Genore's house was ajar, and there was a pretty intimidating black and tan chow tied up right outside that door. He didn't notice any forced entry into the home as he stepped inside, and he did notice bloodstains on the hardwood floor, and they were very prevalent, which told him this is going to be a bad scene. So in the kitchen, he sees a utensil drawer that was still open, and there were several bloody knives inside of that drawer. As a matter of fact, in this section of the house, it was obvious to the detective this is where Genore was initially attacked, and it appeared that she was pursued throughout that house in an attempt to escape whoever did this to her. And it was obvious that that scene culminated in the bedroom, where it appeared the chaos pretty much reached its peak. Inside that bedroom, Detective McKee, he saw the same thing that deputy sheriff, Ronald Johnson, saw. Genore's body was crumpled beside her bed. Her skull, in particular, just bore the marks of a brutal assault. He noticed knife wound puncture marks in several areas and even gunshot wounds. Glancing around the room, he really saw the story. There was broken furniture, shattered glass, even streaks of blood across the walls. It was just horrific. As he's investigating this scene, as you would think, word kind of starts to get out. I mean, this is a small town, right? And there's at this point, a ton of police cars on the scene. Everybody, all these neighbors, even though there's a lot of acreage between everybody, they see him driving down the road and they're calling other neighbors, what happened to Miss G? And eventually a gathering starts taking place in front of the crime scene. It included family, friends, even coworkers left work and drove to Genore's home. So the investigation is on, right? And they're working it from the inside out. As they work all these cases, you start with the people closest to them and you roll them out and keep going outside that circle, if you will. In that circle, it leads them to a young white couple named Philip and Amy Skipper. Now, this young couple, they were navigating challenges, a lot of challenges in life at this time. They were new parents. They were just 23 years old, and they had recently welcomed a baby boy. They were also caring for a 15-year-old by the name of John Beiaillo. And Genore, being the generous person that she was, she wants to take them under her wing, right? She wants to help them. So she gave them some employment opportunities, including taking care of her dogs and horses and maintaining her property. And they kind of became friends. As a matter of fact, she even facilitated a birthday celebration for that newborn son of theirs. And the Skippers, who did not even have a telephone, they were more than welcome to use Genore's phone anytime. She made that available to them when they needed to use the phone. So police, they work the case and they come across a situation involving Genore and one of their own, a 45-year-old Baton Rouge police officer that was recently hired by the department. And there were some claims that he had been stalking Genore, according to her coworkers and friends. Now, her coworker said that he was bombarding her with phone calls at her workplace, sometimes 2-3 times a day. And they'd only been on one date, and it was pretty brief. And according to Genore's colleagues, it quickly soured. There was just nothing there. But she felt uncomfortable with this guy. She would talk to her friends about it, and she tries to distance herself from him. She even tells her friends, look, if he calls me at the office, just say I'm not here, say I'm busy. I don't want to talk to this guy. Now, despite making it what you would think would be completely obvious to this guy that she didn't want anything to do with him, it just made him pursue her harder. He would show up uninvited at Genore's home, and he would be seen kind of lurking around her office while she was there. And one evening, while she was attending to her horses, he shows up at her house unannounced, which really concerned her. And shortly before her tragic death, he even indicated in a message on her cell phone that he was going to come visit her that weekend. So obviously, a lot of red flags to Detective Dan McKee. So McKee, he asked this BRPD officer, he says, man, you're popping up all over the place in this case. Would you mind taking a polygraph? And the police officer agrees to do that. And guess what? He fails that lie detector test. Now, doesn't necessarily mean you're lying. False positives happen a lot. That's why it's not admissible in court, but it's not good. So the detective lets him know, hey man, you failed this lie detector test. I want to talk to you about this some more. And at that point, the BRPD officer says, fuck that. I want my lawyer. I'm not saying anything else. So he lawyers up. They don't have enough evidence at all. They don't have any evidence in order to kind of keep him locked up. So they have to let him go until they can get some evidence, right? So Detective McKee, he's doing everything at this point that he can to find a link between this BRPD officer and the death of Genore. He's looking for evidence anywhere. And he does end up finding a few things, a .22 caliber weapon and some matching bloody footprints, but nothing concrete enough that would definitely say this police officer killed Genore. Now, throughout this case, obviously, the local media starts taking notice, and especially when a BRPD officer is involved in the case and maybe even looked at as a suspect, they're on it. And they publish a headline, and that headline said, police officer suspected in slaying, which obviously totally shocks the community, puts everyone on edge. And the detective, McKee, he has to walk that back. And so he does some interviews and he says, look, we were looking at this guy. He had a relationship with Genore, but there was nothing concrete to say he's involved in any way, shape, or form, etc. And sadly, eventually, that case grows kind of cold. You know, Detective McKee, He's busy. He's working other cases. As a matter of fact, at that time, it was like he was a magnet for higher profile, harder to solve cases. They had a murder of a local drug dealer he was working. They had a man who was killed in his own home that he was working in addition to the Genore case. And they even had a disappearance of a 2-year-old boy during that time. A criminal known as One-Eyed Boo was killed, and he was working that case. So he had plenty to keep him busy, and unfortunately, there just wasn't anything there in the case of Genore and her murder that would lead to anything at that time. But the case of Genore Guillory in particular, it haunted that detective. He wanted to solve it. He couldn't get the images of the brutality of that case out of his mind. Yet every clue he tracked led to pretty much a dead end. He was quoted as saying, "I couldn't find one bad thing out about this woman. Every lead I chased seemed to vanish, and I'm frustrated." However, on July 27th of 2021, there was a breakthrough in that case when a call from a detective in Tangipahoa Parish changed everything for the detective. So another detective called McKee and he said, "I heard you were looking into a year-old homicide, and I have a victim here that I'm working with that has some information on that, possibly." Now, the victim in that case was a 23-year-old woman who was involved in an abusive relationship. So she files a complaint against her boyfriend for assault in Tangipahoa Parish. And she mentions that her boyfriend also had information about the murder of a woman in Clinton, known to many as Miss G. So these two detectives, they're talking to each other on the telephone, and McKee is fired up about this new information. And he hangs up the phone. He says, "We're coming there. We want to talk to her." And he rounds up his sheriff, who is known as Sheriff Bunch, and Detective Joel Odom. They speed towards Tangipahoa Parish to see what information they could get out of this 23-year-old victim. So that 23-year-old victim, she tells McKee the same story regarding her boyfriend and what he told her. And that boyfriend's name was Donnie Fisher. So they look in to Donnie Fisher. And this guy, y'all, he is about as shady as they come. He was only 26 years old, yet he had a rap sheet as long as a freaking CVS receipt. He was a drug dealer, a thief, an armed robber. He's not exactly the guy you'd want your kids to hang out with, or you'd want to hang out with if you were an upstanding citizen, right? So they go to talk to Donnie Fisher, and they pull him into the station and they question him. And McKee was armed with these crime scene photos, and as they're talking to Donnie Fisher, and y'all, this is a tactic in law enforcement, he starts pulling out those gruesome pictures, and he picks the most heart-wrenching ones of Genore's lifeless body on the floor with blood everywhere, her head barely recognizable, and he slams those photos down on the table in front of Fisher, and he yells, "Did she deserve this?" And right there, Fisher breaks. And oh, what a story he has to tell. So Fisher reveals that the night after Genore was murdered, he and his girlfriend moved in with none other than Philip and Amy Skipper, along with a teenager named John Beiaillo. And he says that they were actually hired to clean up Genore's house after the murder by Genore's family. And when they were all busy with the cleanup, he said, Beiaillo casually drops a bombshell about how they took out Genore. He basically says Beiaillo spills all the details. He said that Beiaillo said they shot her, stabbed her, and even used a baseball bat. And it gets worse. He even told Fisher that post-mortem they took turns raping her. He went on to say that later that night, after they clean up the house, Philip Skipper, he's pissed at Beiaillo because he heard him telling Fisher all this. So the next day, Skipper tells Fisher, hey man, let's go take a ride. And they get in the car and they start heading down these country roads in rural Louisiana, right? And one of these roads in particular is just totally deserted. Nothing on either side of the road. You're in the middle of nowhere. And Fisher said at that point, I thought he was going to kill me and just dump me in the middle of nowhere. But he said instead, Philip Fisher actually confirmed Beiaillo's story, saying, what would you think if I told you we killed Miss G? And Fisher said he responded with, I wouldn't think nothing. You wouldn't trust me no more. So Philip Skipper kind of ends the conversation with, if you ever talk, I'm going to kill you. God forgives, but the Brotherhood don't. And I'll get back to what the Brotherhood is a little later on in this story. So back to the investigation. And when you're working a murder case and you're a detective, there's three things that you need. You need means, opportunity, and motive. And guess what? Philip Skipper, he had all three. He lived right across the street. He had easy access to the weapons and even had a key to Genore's house through his wife. But the big question was why? Why would he want to kill her? I mean, initially the Skippers were friends with Genore. But as the detective dug deeper, he found out there was a situation that caused a rift between the Skippers and Genore. And it came down to a goat, of all things. So McKee, he discovers that a month before Genore's death, one of Genore's pit bulls killed a goat that belonged to the Skippers. So Amy Skipper, the wife, she goes over to Genore's house and she basically rips her ass over a goat, to the point that Genore is crying. The fight was so intense, in fact, that Genore told several of her friends after this and even stated that she was done with the Skippers for good. But the detective, he's thinking there's no way a goat would cause them to murder Genore so brutally. So he keeps digging and he discovers something else that would be an even larger motive. And that was a $25,000 life insurance policy that Genore had, in which Philip and Amy Skipper were the beneficiaries. So when the detective asked Fisher if he knew anything about this, Fisher claimed that Philip was actually expecting a larger payout, somewhere around $100,000, and was furious when he found out it was only a $25,000 policy. So that quickly, we have motive. So on August 8th of 2021, McKee, along with some state troopers and detectives, they gear up for this big operation at the Skipper's trailer. And at this time, it's been over a year since Genore was murdered. So it's a pretty tense situation. So they break down the door and they find several things. They find a stash of knives. They find a couple of baseball bats. They even find some .22 caliber ammo and even a handful of spent shell casings from a .22. Now, that's important because she was stabbed, she was hit with baseball bats, and she was shot with a .22 caliber weapon. And why the hell would you have spent shell casings, right? Nobody keeps that. So McKee, he doesn't waste any time. He swoops up the evidence and then he swoops up Philip Skipper and he charges him with the first-degree murder of Genore Guillory. Then, a few days later, he's hot on the trail of Beiaillo, who was hiding out at a friend's trailer, but when the cops come a-knocking, Beiaillo isn't exactly planning to go down without a fight. So he makes a run for it into the woods. But after about 30 minutes of playing hide and seek, the Tangipahoa deputies, they unleash the canines. And Beiaillo, he don't like the canines. He doesn't want any of that. He comes out of hiding and gets arrested. So throughout this story, there's someone I haven't told you about. And this guy is a real piece of shit. His name is Johnny Hoyt. And Hoyt probably had the worst rap sheet of all of these fools. At just 22 years old, he already had aggravated robbery charges, assault charges, just a rap sheet as long as my arm. And he had the tough guy look. His head was shaved almost to his scalp. He had this real thick goatee. He just looked like the kind of guy that you not necessarily going to pick a fight with, right? Pretty intimidating looking guy. But Hoyt was not your average scumbag. He was also the mastermind of a budding skinhead group called the Brotherhood. And alongside him were his original crew members. Guess who? Philip Skipper and John Beiaillo. And these guys, they weren't just hanging out, making up their own little club, right? They had the letters GFBD tattooed across their back. And guess what that stood for? God forgives, the Brotherhood doesn't. And according to Donnie Fisher, Hoyt was also involved in the murder of Genore Guillory. So the detective, he goes on the search for Johnny Hoyt, and he actually finds him serving time in a federal prison where he was placed 3 months after the murder of Genore for possessing 3 sawed-off shotguns by a felon. Here's what happened after all the dust settled in this murder and everyone was interviewed and the pieces were pieced together. Philip Skipper, John Beiaillo, they hop into Philip's pickup truck and they head to Holden, Louisiana. Now, Holden is a small town. It's about 40 miles from Clinton, and they're on a mission. They're going there to pick up Johnny Hoyt. So they pick him up and they head back to Clinton, and they're getting drunk, doing shots. They're doing drugs. They're doing a ton of Valium, actually. And things take kind of a dark turn when Beiaillo, he just starts firing a .22 caliber revolver into the sky. And he turns to Philip and he says, "Would you like to kill an N-word? And I'll let you fill that in." So once they get back to Skipper's trailer, Beiaillo is so shit-faced, he can't hardly get out of the truck. He steps out of the truck and just busts his ass. And then they go into the trailer. But around 1 a.m., Johnny Hoyt, he decides to wake up Beiaillo from his drunken stupor. And he says, "It's time for you to earn that tattoo on your back. So take your shoes off so you don't leave no footprints, and let's go." So with Beiaillo leading the charge, they walk out of the trailer and they walk across that gravel road and they walk up to Genore Guillory's house. So Beiaillo, he claims that this was all over an initiation into the Brotherhood. And in his version, it all went down like this. Lisa, she approaches the side door of Genore's house. And y'all, Lisa is Johnny Hoyt's girlfriend. And she kind of faked that she needed some money. She needed to buy diapers for her baby. And did Genore have any money for diapers? And as Genore's talking to her about this, Philip Skipper, Johnny Hoyt, and John Beiaillo, they're in the background. They're in the shadows waiting for their opportunity. Genore, she's clad in a long blue nightgown. She's accompanied by her chow, and her chow's name was Cleo. She answers the door. She's talking to Lisa, and Hoyt jumps into the door and punches Genore. The dog, the chow, then lunges at Hoyt. He's defending his owner, right? But Beiaillo manages to restrain the dog, and he takes the dog and ties the dog with a rope. Genore then takes off running. She's trying to get to something, and she grabs the phone in the kitchen. She grabs her keys at the same time. She runs to the front door, and the front door is locked, and she's fumbling with those keys and just drops the keys on the ground. She finally goes back to the kitchen. She tries to pick up the phone. It gets slapped out of her hand, which is why the busy signal was being reported by her coworkers. Remember, I told you that at the beginning? And there's a trail of blood. You can just follow her throughout that house. She gets to that drawer in the kitchen. She opens the drawer. She grabs a knife, but Hoyt, he's relentless, and she's just unable to defend herself effectively. She takes off running again. She retreats to that bedroom, and that was pretty much her last stand. She gets shot in her left hand and arm. She continues to fight, but ultimately she was stabbed multiple times by Lisa, numerous wounds, one of which pierced her left lung. And then, as if that weren't enough, the perpetrators pick up a ceramic lamp and a couple of baseball bats to ensure she was dead. Beiaillo was even quoted as saying she fought all the way to the end. So the four perpetrators at that time, they looted the home of the Guillory. They take the dog, they tie it up right outside the door, and they returned to the trailer. At this point, they get indicted for first-degree murder and a slew of other charges. Philip Skipper was also charged with the repeated aggravated rape of John Beiaillo, who they found out he had been raping after Beiaillo had been in his custody for 3 years. They also indicted Lisa Hoyt. Now, Lisa's involvement in the brutal murder of Genore Guillory surprised even the most hardened investigators at first, but later, after Sheriff Bunch figured her out, he's like, that girl is absolutely evil. She comes from an evil family. Now, McKee, he didn't quit once the arrest happened. He kept digging, looking for as many details as possible about these four killers. And he found out that less than 2 weeks after Genore Guillory's murder, a dope dealer in St. Helena Parish, a guy with a habit of flashing wads of cash, he had been shot in the head on a gravel road. Someone then set the dope dealer and his pickup truck on fire. And just after that murder, Lisa Hoyt told friends that she was the one who shot the dealer in the head, and her husband, Johnny Hoyt, he helped burn the body. He even found out the four of them also dabbled in grave robbing. They broke into coffins, and they would steal jewelry, watches, gold teeth from the body of the dead. Beiaillo even said it was dirty work. They would pry open the lid of one coffin, spot a nice ring, and when they pulled the ring off, the finger came off with it. What a fucking bunch of sick people. Lisa even bragged to a friend that an antique watch she wore came from a grave. And the sheriff said they were taking people's teeth and making necklaces out of them. Wow. So they're sitting in jail and something very shocking happens. The charges actually get dropped. After the lab results came back, there were no identifiable fingerprints at the crime scene. The baseball bat McKee found at Philip Skipper's trailer had been outside for a year, so the rain had washed away any DNA evidence that might have been used on it. The gun used to shoot Genore had been a revolver. There were no shell casings from the crime scene to compare to those that I told you McKee had found in Philip Skipper's trailer. So they just didn't have anything to compare. According to Beiaillo, the gun itself had been broken into pieces and tossed into the Amy River. And Hoyt, Philip, and Lisa, they all refused to talk. They weren't saying anything. Only Beiaillo was saying all this. Now, the life insurance policy, which did pay out $25,000 to Philip and Amy Skipper 3 months after the murder, it was really just circumstantial evidence. just because somebody gets life insurance doesn't mean they killed somebody, right? The second and third hand accounts from people who came forward and said they heard Philip and others admit to killing Genore Guillory, that was all considered hearsay in court. The only thing they had was John Beiaillo's statement. And that's not, is he believable? I mean, this guy's got kind of a record. He's not exactly someone that a jury would believe in a lot of cases. But the cops, they want to take it to trial. The DA, he didn't. He didn't think there was enough there. So in January of 2002, 4 months after their arrest, guess what? All the charges get dropped, except for Beiaillo, because he had confessed during telling the police about this whole scenario. He gets left in jail. Now, later that year, voters in East Feliciana, they're outraged over this, and they end up voting the DA out of office and put in a young, aggressive new district attorney, who is still the district attorney, incidentally, in East Feliciana Parish. His name was Sam DeQuilla, and I've actually met him. He's been in the studio. Now, before DeQuilla's election, Sheriff Bunch extracted a promise from the aspiring district attorney that if he got elected, he would take a fresh look at the Guillory case. And he also lobbied DeQuilla pretty hard. He wanted the case prosecuted, and DeQuilla wanted it prosecuted as well. McKee said that DeQuilla was on board from the get-go. Now, unlike other prosecutors, DeQuilla wasn't afraid to take a chance, and as soon as he took office, he reopened that Guillory case. Although he knew the case had problems, he wanted a jury to decide it. So DeQuilla charges all 4 with second-degree murder. It was a simpler charge to prove and less costly to prosecute than first-degree murder. The charge didn't allow for the death penalty, but in Louisiana, second-degree murder does carry a mandatory life sentence. And life means life in Louisiana. So he then offers a deal to John Beiaillo. He had been in jail since his arrest in August of 2001, and he basically told Beiaillo, look, if you'll testify against the other 3, DeQuilla would let him plead guilty as a juvenile and recommend a sentence of juvenile life, which would get him out of jail on his 21st birthday. And it's important to note, without Beiaillo's testimony, DeQuilla has nothing. He has nothing. That's the only person that witnessed any of this, right? So he had to cut a deal with the devil, basically. And he said, we tried to make the best case that we could. And in July of 2004, an East Feliciana jury, they find Philip Skipper guilty of second-degree murder. Johnny Hoyt, he then goes on trial in February of 2005, and guess what? He's also found guilty of second-degree murder, and both were sentenced to life in prison in Bloody Angola. Now, Lisa Hoyt, she pleads guilty to manslaughter, and she gets sentenced to the maximum of manslaughter, which is 40 years in prison. And in exchange for his testimony, Beiaillo was prosecuted as a juvenile. He pled guilty to second-degree murder, was sentenced to what's known as juvenile life. No charges were ever filed against Amy Skipper. Both Don McKee and Sam DeQuilla were convinced that she didn't play any part in Genore Guillory's murder. When asked what he thinks of them, meaning Johnny and Lisa and Philip, Sam DeQuilla shook his head and said, those are some evil people. And that is the tragic story of Miss Genore Guillory and the incarceration in Bloody Angola of those who killed her. Thank you so much for listening. I'm about to get real active with the Patreon. So check it out. Check us out on Facebook. Give us a follow. Please rate the podcast if you have not yet done so and you're enjoying the content. And until next time, I'm Jim Chapman for Bloody Angola, a podcast 142 years in the making, the complete story of America's bloodiest prison. Peace.
straight line, shackled and chained. Oh, Gruesome Gertie is calling my name. There is no mercy in this penitentiary. Just ask the Heel String Gang, Wrangle